Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second update of TSI related issues. I have with me colleagues from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And first off, I'm Keelan Morgan, and I'm the Program Specialist for Developmental Education. We have with us Dr. Suzanne Morales-Vale, who is the Director of Adult and Developmental Education. We have Dr. Melissa Humphreys, who is our developmental education reporting guru at the coordinating board. And we also have with us our colleague from the college board, Kathy Montanesi. So at this time, I'm going to yield the floor to Suzanne, and we're going to get started with the webinar.
Thank you, Keelan. Go ahead and click to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to let everyone know there was a little snafu in getting the first webinar posted to our YouTube page. Apparently, we have two YouTube pages, but it is now corrected. And if you haven't had a chance yet to view the first webinar, obviously there will be some overlap in terms of content with this one. But you're more than welcome to view the first webinar, and it is found at the coordinating board's main YouTube page. And then a recording of this webinar will be available by close of business on April 14th. And then just to remind everyone that both the coordinating board and Texas Education Agency both have frequently asked questions and COVID-19 update web pages. And those FAQs are regularly updated, and the links are found here to both of those. And we definitely invite you to look at those, because many of your questions, whether they're TSI related or especially non-TSI related as well, will be found on those pages. Next slide.
Real quick, Suzanne, a quick housekeeping issue. If you're going to ask a question, I'm going to request that you do it through the formal question and answer and not the chat feature. I'll be monitoring the chat feature throughout the webinar. However, it's easier to respond to the questions if they come in through the specific question and answer portal. However, I will be monitoring the chat, and when we get to the end, I'll scroll back through, and any questions presented, I'll do my best to bring them up to Dr. Morales-Vale to answer.
Great, thank you, Keelan. So we had quite a few questions, as you can imagine, with regard to access to the Texas Success Initiative assessment. And as we mentioned last time, Examity and ProctorU are approved by the College Board to be used as remote proctoring services. The launch for Examity is expected on April 17th, with full capacity expected by May 1st. ProctorU will not be available until May 1st or around May 1st. But both of those, again, have been approved, and they will be ready to go soon. They're continuing to hire and train proctors. And again, just to reiterate that TEA has approved not only the actual cost of the assessment, but also remote proctor service fees for 11th and 12th grade students, and that they would, school districts would be eligible for reimbursement. Actually, not only school districts, but also public charter schools. And just to remind everyone, however, these would be in the areas of reading and math only, and only those two subject areas. Next slide. Something that we have just confirmed. We have been meeting with College Board, and thank you, Kathy, and your team for helping us make this happen. But we now confirm that the use of video chat services like WebEx, GoToMeeting, and Zoom for TSIA test administration is approved for both institutions of higher education and public school districts and public charters. We do, however, want to also just caution you that many of you, while you may have existing license agreements and subscriptions to some of these services, that you need to have your test administrator confirm with these services to ensure that any limits associated with time limits during these proctoring sessions and other possible restrictions are resolved prior to you actually using this service with students. Next slide. So other things to consider when you use these types of services, we just want to reiterate also that the test proctors who would be able to do the proctoring for the TSIA have to be TSIA certified, and that a maximum of 5 test administrations at one time per proctor, and of course strict adherence to all ACTA test certification requirements, as well as security and other practices as outlined in the TSIA AccuPlacer test platform. And the key to go there for your test administrators is the resource tab. At the resource tab, you'll find not only a link to a training video on how to use these chat services to proctor tests, but also a number of other documents that give step-by-step instructions specifically for test administrators on how to set this up. My understanding is it's just a matter of locating the right place in the drop-down menu and clicking on. There's no requirement to actually go to these web services and have anything enabled there. It's already been enabled through the platform. And of course, as you can imagine, to help ensure reliable and valid test results, we want to just remind everyone that all test administrations will continue to be closely monitored to ensure compliance, especially during this time. And access to test administration for this specific test can possibly be deactivated if there is an issue with compliance. Next slide. I just wanted to remind everyone also that the Zoom, WebEx, and GoToMeeting option is available immediately. It's available as soon as your test administrator gets into the platform, reviews the information. Of course, when I say immediately, that's with the caveat that if your TSIA certified proctors have not used this platform before, certainly we do highly recommend that some training is that the proctors engage in training, and that they feel really confident. And once they do feel confident, they start out perhaps with one test, and then they can expand to more tests as they begin to feel more confident with this proctoring platform. The last thing we would want to have is, and perhaps a proctor who may not be quite familiar with this, to have to possibly negatively impact a student's testing session. So please, test administrators, please ensure that the proctors who will be using this access to the TSIA do have the appropriate training. And again, as I mentioned, the training video is available in the test platform, along with a number of other documents to help you facilitate the remote proctoring. So in terms of summer 2020, this is something we spoke with last time during the webinar. We just want to remind everyone that the first thing you definitely want to do, this is for entering undergraduates who have not yet met an exemption. You definitely want to verify first that indeed the student has not met an exemption. And those, of course, are outlined in the administrative code, rule 4.54. So one option to consider for these entering undergraduates for summer is to enroll the student directly in a co-requisite model. Next slide. Another option for entering undergraduates, again, this is just what we talked about during the last webinar, is to go ahead and use the exceptional circumstances clause in rule 4.55A, and that is to go ahead and enroll the student without assessment directly into the freshman level academic course, but then know that the assessment will need to occur by the end of the first semester of enrollment. And in this case, since we're talking about summer would be the semester. So for dual credit, again, same option is available. But before you go to the options, please verify that the student has not met one or more of the eligibility requirements. Of course, they only need to meet one, but those requirements, those eligibility requirements are outlined in the administrative code, rule 4.85. So once that has been established that the student has not met an eligibility requirement, then the dual credit students also have, or the institution has the option to enroll the student in a co-requisite model. However, the institution should be aware that the developmental ed component of that co-requisite model is not eligible for state appropriations. Next slide. For summer dual credit students, just like the undergraduate students, as we mentioned previously, another option is to use the exceptional circumstances clause of Rule 4.55 and enroll the student directly in the freshman level academic course without assessment, but again, the student should be assessed no later than the end of that summer session. Next slide. There is one more option available for dual credit students, and this is in the case if the student is non-degree or non-certificate seeking and enrolling in individual courses, then the institution could possibly consider using Rule 4.54, which is the TSI exemption for non-degree seeking students. Notice that we don't provide this option in general for undergraduate students or high school complete students because those students are often using federal financial aid, Pell Grant, federal student loans, work study, etc. And if a student is non-degree seeking, then any sort of federal financial aid is not applicable. They cannot use federal financial aid if the student is non-degree seeking or non-certificate seeking. So again, for undergraduates, entering undergraduates, they have to be degree seeking in order to access federal financial aid. And then of course, a very important additional consideration is that institutions should ensure that their practices, whatever they choose to use, are consistent with current SACS Commission on Colleges standards and policy. Next slide. So additional recommendations. We just want to remind everyone that most institutions have several courses that are non-TSI liable. And what we mean by that, these are freshman entry-level academic courses that do not have a TSI reading and or writing or math requirement. So we call these non-TSI liable courses. Some examples may be a speech class, art appreciation, introduction to business, a learning framework class. These courses are often in the institution's core curriculum, and so they would also be eligible for dual credit purposes. But again, they do not require a TSI test. And so that would be something that we just want to remind everyone that may be an option for, especially your entering your rising 9th and 10th graders. Also, we talked about the remote proctoring capacities, but we also know that we don't want students to not have options available via remote proctoring because all of the registration time slots have been taken up. So we understand there still will be, to some degree, a capacity issue. So in order to address that, we also recommend perhaps considering limiting TSIA testing to one, maybe two subject areas. The go-to recommendation for rising 9th and 10th graders would be reading. If the student meets the college readiness benchmark on the TSIA in reading, they will have access to a number of core curriculum courses. Examples include history, government, political science, psychology, sociology, philosophy. And then for the older rising 11th and 12th graders, perhaps consider reading and writing or math. And we especially recommend math for the juniors and seniors because they will more likely have been exposed to the content that will give them a better chance of doing well on the TSIA math section. One other caveat with both TSI, non-TSI liable courses and the courses that are designated as reading intensive and or reading and writing intensive, that each institution makes its own designation. However, there are certainly a lot of commonalities. For example, most institutions designate English 1301 as both reading and writing. Most institutions designate a psychology, the intro to psychology course as reading intensive. Again, but that said, we definitely ask you to check with your partnering institution and they will provide the list of all available courses that are non-TSI liable or reading and or writing intensive. The math area is pretty obvious. Those usually don't change. They typically are your college algebra, your intro to statistics, your quantitative reasoning, or contemporary math. Next slide. So the big question is, now that you have 2 or as many as 3 options for your students, both dual credit and you're entering undergraduates, the question I'm sure many institutions will ask themselves, is it one size fits all the best choice for the student? So we would just like to make some recommendations when you're considering the options and when you're trying to determine for this particular student, is a co-requisite option the best? Or is direct placement into a college credit course the best option, either through Rule 4.55 or 4.54? So additional considerations, first of all, is what is the student's intent? Does the student intend to enroll in college or seek a degree or certificate? That would be an important determination to ask. Also, the next six bullets. These are also indicators that have been correlated in research and literature to varying degrees of college readiness or college success. And those include looking at the student's high school GPA, course taking patterns. Of course, this would be especially applicable for your entering undergrads who have already completed high school. So for example, did they complete 4 years of math and 4 years of English and so forth? Successful completion of Algebra 2 or higher math. Again, this would be specifically or particularly applicable for seniors, perhaps some juniors, and entering undergraduates. Is there any evidence of pre-AP, AP, or IB courses? These are generally considered more of the advanced courses, and so considering those courses would be something that may also be in the wheelhouse of additional indicators that your institution would like to consider. And then also some of the non-cognitive factors, the student's level of motivation, self-efficacy, and including those other things like asking the student, do they expect to work? And if they are working, how many hours will they be working? Do they have other family responsibilities? We know many high school kids do have some responsibilities of taking care of siblings and so forth. And of course, for our entering undergraduates, some of our students have families, spouses that are deployed, and other considerations, which may perhaps limit some of the time that they're able to spend engaged in the coursework that they're enrolled in. And so again, these are factors that we recommend that you consider when determining whether placement in a co-requisite or direct placement in the college credit course is the best option for the student. Next slide. So of course, one of the most common questions we also get is, what about the academic year starting fall 2020? Currently in the FAQ, we do want to emphasize, again, as we all know, what we are living in and breathing right now changes almost daily. So our current circumstances change almost daily and will likely to continue to evolve greatly in the next few months. If at all possible, we recommend postponing decisions regarding starting fall enrollments for students not meeting TSI exemptions or for students who don't meet the code rule 4.85 until May 1st. And May 1st, we do expect to come back and provide additional guidance with regard to fall enrollments. Again, let me reiterate, this date may change. I know that there may be a number of different factors that are coming into play. And so there may be additional guidance given sooner. And of course, as soon as that guidance is available, we certainly will share that with the field upon final approval from our commissioner and coordinating board leadership. But that said, again, as is shown in our current FAQ document, May 1st is the current timeline that we're looking at. We also want to remind everyone, especially when it comes to TSI, Any student can enroll right now without any testing, without any other indicator. Any student can enroll immediately in non-TSI libel courses without meeting testing or without meeting Rule 4.85. And that goes for both dual credit students and entering undergraduate students. So maybe the low-hanging fruit would be to go to your institution of higher ed and confirm with them which courses are designated as non-TSI liable and would be available for student enrollment. Next slide. So Melissa, if you want to chime in at this point regarding summer reporting considerations.
Sure. Yes. Reporting will still happen. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Let me try again. Right now, we haven't made any major decisions about anything changing with regard to reporting, but we will be in contact with your reporting officers. It'll also be posted in the FAQ if anything changes. And feel free to email me if there are specific questions about this.
Thank you, Melissa. We do want to reiterate, because especially for your dual credit population, these are new options that were not previously available. We will be very closely monitoring which decision-making indicators that institutions used, especially for placement for the dual credit population. So we're still in talks, and of course Melissa and her team are vetting the ideas and brainstorming the various ideas as we speak, but just be aware that we are going to be especially interested in the institution's indicators that were indeed used to make placement decisions, especially for the dual credit population. Next slide. So that brings us to the Q&A portion again. Again, as I mentioned last time, most of this was already also covered in the last webinar. There are a number of questions about folks who have some interest in the 50% House Bill 2223 co-requisite enrollment for summer requirement. And we just want to let everyone know, as of the live moment of this webinar, no determination has been made yet with regard to that requirement, but we expect a determination very soon. Same thing again with the fall 2020 requirement of the 75% of your developmental education enrollments have to be in a co-requisite model. Slide 13 just reiterates that if you can possibly finalize your placement decisions after May 1st, when we will provide more guidance, then that certainly would be a good option. But again, to reiterate, there is a great possibility that additional guidance may come sooner than May 1st. And certainly if that happens, and once that happens, we will share that additional guidance as soon as it is finalized by coordinating board leadership. We also continue to have questions about Blackboard and Blackboard Collaborative for online test proctoring. And again, that is not possible because of the two-step security authentication that is required for TSIA testing, and that wouldn't be available through that portal. If you don't feel like you have any access to the assessment for your students, please contact your institutions of higher ed. Please work with your school districts and your public charter schools to try to come up with some sort of mechanism where both dual credit students and entering undergraduate students have access to testing. Again, now that Zoom and WebEx and GoToMeeting and other video chat services are available for test proctoring, we hope that does open up access to many more students. We know that it will take a great deal of coordination and planning to enable this, but again, the platform under the resource tab will have a training video and a number of other resource documents that will help you to implement the remote proctoring option. Still no word on the meningitis shot. questions. And of course, just like before, as soon as something is finalized, we'll let the field know about that. Next slide. So again, if you evoke Rule 4.55, which is the exceptional circumstance clause, which would allow an institution to directly place a non-exempt student or a dual credit student who has not yet met one of the eligibility requirements of 4.85, those students would be able to be directly placed in a college level course. But by the end of the summer term, that student will need to be assessed. And what assessments are usable for that purpose, just like in current rule, that would be the TSIA or the SAT or ACT if those tests come on, if and when those tests come online again. We're hearing from our College Board partners that they are, as we speak again, vetting all kinds of different options to ensure that students will have access to those tests as soon as possible. The TSIA 2.0 launch has been postponed a month. The new launch date is September 28th, 2020. But like everything else we've said, that may also be subject to change depending on circumstances. And again, the final question is, can school districts and public charter schools use WebEx, Zoom, GoToMeeting, or other video chat web services to remotely proctor the TSIA? And the answer is yes. And your school districts or charter schools TSIA test administrator will find instructions and additional details on the test platform under the resource tab. Next slide. So we also had a number of questions about Chromebooks. Apparently, it seems a number of school districts have passed out these Chromebooks for their students to access distance learning while the schools are closed. Unfortunately, the Chromebooks are not compatible with Examity or ProctorView. So if your students are using Chromebooks, then of course you have the other option is to use one of the video chat services for your students to be able to access the TSIA. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. I did want to clarify something else. For those school districts that have early college high schools or PTEC schools, we want to just reiterate that it is not a requirement that you test your students on the TSIA prior to them engaging in those school models. So again, the students can be admitted to those models, and it is not contingent upon a TSIA test result. Also, you don't have to test in all three areas. So if you want to limit those students to perhaps testing, as we recommended earlier, maybe just in the area of reading as the first go-to during this, challenging time period when access to the TSIA is very limited, that would be one option for your district to consider. Of course, Stacey Avery from Texas Education Agency would be your go-to person if you have any other questions with regard to early college, high school, and PTEC and testing. We recommend that you contact Stacey Avery at the Texas Education Agency, and she can give you more details and walk you through the various options. And again, we want to reiterate that non-TSI liable courses do not require any sort of testing, and any student, including your rising ninth grade dual credit student all the way through the entering undergraduates, can enroll in these courses without any testing. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. Keelan, would you like to go ahead and add anything else?
Yes, Suzanne, I'll go ahead and go through a number of the questions, and I'll take a initial gander at responding to some of them, and definitely team Suzanne, Melissa, Kathy, if I miss something, feel free to chime in and I will mute and yield the floor to you. A very interesting question that came in, and Suzanne, you'll probably chime in on this one as well as Kathy. When using the chat service to proctor the TSIA, TSIA, what do we have the test taker do with the scratch paper after the exam has been completed?
So I'll jump in. This is Kathy. The proctor needs to see this or instruct the student, I should say, to rip it up into like confetti-sized pieces. The one thing that we want to assure everybody is that the likelihood of a student, let's say a student wrote down a question and all of the choices, the likelihood of a student being able to see that exact same question again, if they retest or share it with their friend, is very, very small. The other thing that we're doing is we are keeping close watch on items during this time, adding extra security measures so that we will we will be replacing items much faster than our normal rotation is. So that's how we're addressing that.
Thank you, Kathy, for chiming in on that. I also just want to reiterate, remember the TSIA is a computer adaptive test. So a quick sort of layperson way of understanding computer adaptive testing is if you have a room of 30 students and they all start the TSIA, the same subject area, and they're all starting at the same time, it is very unlikely that any of those 30 students will actually see the same test question. They will see a test question that has been categorized and identified at a medium level of difficulty, and then there are a couple of other characteristics that are going to be common to that type of test question. But again, the likelihood that the student will actually, that all the students will actually see the same question is very slim, as Kathy reiterated. Thank you.
And there's a number of questions that came in regards to the use of Microsoft Teams for as a means of virtual proctoring. And I know in our conversations, we've really been along the lines of Zoom, WebEx, and those types of services. However, Microsoft Teams, to my understanding, is not going to offer the same security protocols, i.e. having to break the students out into individual rooms as the other services offer. So it will not be able to be used for the purposes of virtual proctoring, unless at a later date, if it's a true one-on-one situation and the college board and consult with the coordinating board vets that idea, we'll come back to you and let you know if that's an appropriate resource. But as of now, it's not one that's on that approved list. And Kathy, Suzanne, chime in if I'm misspeaking.
No, you are absolutely right. There are criteria, and unfortunately, Teams doesn't meet. And the one you already mentioned, the separate them into individual rooms if you are testing multiple students, doesn't exist with Teams. That you have to be able to see and hear the student at the same time, them and their screen. And then the third one is you have to be able to share screens and take control of the student's screen. So I don't believe Teams meets those requirements.
Actually, say someone just chimed in. Someone just chimed in the chat and say they were able to create breakout rooms in Teams, in Microsoft Teams. So that might be something that we actually have to look into a little further before we can officially move forward. But as of now, that hadn't been a platform that had really been vetted for this purpose. There was another comment in the chat box that came in regarding the Zoom is limited to 40 minutes in length when it is free. This is I'll give a twofold response. So for K-12, Zoom is temporarily lifted that 40-minute restriction for the purpose of allowing that platform to be used in place of the traditional class day meetings. So they can have full-length class meetings via Zoom. So there's a slight registration process that one person from the district has to complete. And if you go to zoom.com to the COVID-19 resources, it's real easy to find, and it tells the districts exactly what they have to do to complete that registration process. And again, only one person from the district has to complete that registration process, and it'll take care of the entire domain for the district. As it relates to higher education, that's something you'll have to consult with your individual IT departments regarding, in terms of what type of site licensing that you have, if you have a site license through your institution for Zoom, or if you're using your own personal account. Um, there cannot be a time restriction associated with it, and Suzanne alluded to that in the question and answer when she covered the compatibility of Zoom. Suzanne, can you chime in real quick? There was a question from one of our colleagues at a major community college that wanted to know about the dual credit and co-requisite piece one more time, as the traditional understanding is that dual credit students cannot enroll in co-requisite models.
Yes, thank you. So the developmental ed component of a co-requisite model, as we all know, just to quickly explain the co-requisite model for those of you who may not be familiar, a co-requisite model is designed for a student who has not yet demonstrated college readiness. So we call that student underprepared in higher ed. In K-12, most likely it would be a student who has not met one of the eligibility criteria in 4.85. For that student to be able to enroll directly in a college level course, but also will be required to co-enroll, so have a same simultaneous enrollment in a developmental ed course or intervention. And that developmental ed course or intervention is aligned directly to the learning outcomes and the activities and the assessment of the college course. And it is designed to give the student additional support, time on task, practice and feedback, perhaps filling in some knowledge and skill gaps, so that it helps to ensure the student's successful completion of the college course. So yes, traditionally, the co-requisite model, we have made it very clear that it was for the use for undergraduate, in other words, high school complete students. However, we looked through the rules, and there is a provision in Rule 9.146 that would allow, under special circumstances, a dual credit student to be enrolled in a co-requisite model. However, we need to reiterate that the developmental ed component of that co-requisite model is not eligible for state appropriations. So your reporting folks would have to just be aware, and of course, your institution's administration and chief financial officer, et cetera, would need to be aware if your institution decides to go that route with the dual credit students or with certain populations of the dual credit student, that during this time, the co-requisite option is available, but again, your institution would not be able to submit for any sort of state appropriation funding reimbursement for the developmental ed components.
And Suzanne, can I step in? This is Melissa.
Absolutely.
And you did mention about reporting, folks knowing what to do about this. And we absolutely do want institutions to report when their dual credit students are being placed in a co-requisite model. And that option will be available. We're lifting all of the edit checks that in the past have not allowed that reporting to happen because it wasn't allowed for high school or non-high school complete students to be in co-requisite. But because this is happening, please, we'll send out information about this, but if you happen to be in touch with your reporting people, it still needs to be reported. It just cannot be reported for funding.
Excellent point, Melissa. So we don't, without getting too much in the subtleties of reporting, there are several places that your reporting people on campus have to, several reports where they report various enrollments for various purposes. So there is one report where they would report the actual enrollment, and then there's another report where they would report that enrollment for reimbursement for funding purposes. So again, it would be reporting the developmental ed component in terms of ensuring that we understand the student was placed in a developmental ed, the dual credit student was placed in a developmental ed option, but your reporting person would not then report for funding purposes, would not be able to report to get state appropriations for the developmental ed component. The college level component would still be available for funding.
All right, Suzanne, got to chime in. Our colleague from TEA has chimed in and wanted me to mention something. So to all of our K-12 colleagues that are listening in on the webinar, that if you have specific questions related to the reimbursement funding for the testing fees for TSIA, just know that contact TEA directly. It's part of the House Bill 3 requirement and is for one exam only, either the SAT, SAT, or TSIA reading or math, and those are required for reimbursement. And then only students in the spring of their junior year or during their senior year are eligible. There's a number of nuances to this, so we definitely want to defer to our experts over at TEA as you consider developing your testing plans for your students.
Thank you, Keelan, for reiterating that. Yes, please, again, please contact the experts at TEA. Stacey Avery would be one of the points of contact if you have any questions regarding your school district's reimbursement for TSIA. And again, as Keelan mentioned, there's only one test that would be eligible for reimbursement under House Bill 3. Now, currently, we know the SAT and ACT are not available, but once those tests do become available again, this is something that your school district will want to vet and consider when they make testing decisions. And again, we highly recommend that that vetting happen now with guidance of TEA so that your school district makes the best decision.
All right. Say the next question, Suzanne, while you're chiming in, how long do we expect these placement protocols that you've shared to be in place in terms of the use of 4.55 for dual credit students as well as traditional higher ed students?
So as we speak, coordinating board leadership has approved these options for summer enrollments for both dual credit and entering undergraduates. I also am aware that as we speak, additional options and also options for fall and spring enrollments are currently under consideration. And as soon as final approvals have been made by our coordinating board leadership, we will certainly share that. As of right now, we have May 1st as a date where further information will be available regarding fall and spring 2021 enrollments. But again, that certainly can happen much sooner than that. We understand that many institutions are already starting their orientations for fall and their enrollments, not only for summer, but also for fall. So just know that coordinating board leadership is working as quickly as possible to make all of the guidance and provide guidance for those fall enrollments available as quickly as possible.
All right. And there's another question that came in that we've previously discussed, but just for the we've discussed among ourselves, but there's a question that came in terms of the other indicators that could be used to place students. Can the PSAT 8-9 version be used for the purposes of placing dual credit students?
So currently, everyone is familiar with the Administrative Code Rule 4.85, and it specifically says the only PSAT version to make a student eligible for dual credit enrollments is the PSAT MNSQT version. So that rule has not changed. So when we talked about when your institution is deciding for, especially for dual credit students, what option is best, whether it's a co-requisite option or whether it's direct placement, and we know one size does not fit all, and we know some students may be better in one option versus another, that there are certain indicators that we have shared that we invite your institution to consider. All of those indicators that we mentioned have been correlated in the research and literature to varying degrees to college readiness or college success. The 8th, 9th version of the PSAT has not. And so what we wanted to do when we offered those additional indicators, we did want to focus on those areas that have some indication in research and literature, some sort of correlation to a college readiness or college success. Now, that said, again, the big caveat is leadership is considering additional options. And again, those options should be available either prior to May 1st or by May 1st at the latest for your consideration. And so those additional indicators or additional options may add to the available options that are currently approved.
Thank you, Suzanne. The next question is, so if we enroll a student in a college level course without their TSIA scores and they test within that semester on the TSIA and they're not successful in that particular subject area, do we drop them from the class?
No, we would not recommend dropping them. What we would recommend, since you do have evidence at that point, once you receive that test result, we recommend to look at the kind of performance the student has already completed. So for example, are there any tests that the student has completed or any activities? So consult with the faculty member. If the student is doing well at that point, then we absolutely encourage the student to continue to do well, perhaps offer some, remind the student there's tutoring in case there's the student does end up struggling, there's tutoring available, supplemental instruction, or any other supports. On the other hand, if the student at that point is not doing well, if there's indication that the student is barely hanging on and passing, or perhaps not even passing at that point, we highly recommend the institution to actively engage in some sort of required additional support to, much like perhaps tutoring or supplemental instruction, something that the student can engage in to give that student that extra support that they clearly need in order to successfully complete the course.
All right.
If I could just add, as you can tell, that does get to be somewhat of a perhaps nuanced and a little bit of a complex circumstance situation. So we absolutely highly recommend that institutions think through those various options and what kind of tools and recommendations that they will have for their students who find themselves in the situation once they do test. One thing that I do want to reiterate, however, if the student, regardless if it's a dual credit student or an undergraduate student, has successfully completed the college level course, at that point, the student would be considered college ready and will not need to test because the student is already college ready. So the student's successful completion of the course should be adequate indication, as we've always said, a student's successful completion of the college level course would be an indicator of college readiness. Of course, that is by subject area. And please note, of course, if the college course was not a TSI liable course, then any sort of indicator of college readiness would not be applicable in that case. But if the student is enrolled and successfully completes a history course, for example, that is TSI liable in reading, then the student's successful completion of that history course would mean the student is TSI met in reading.
All right. That was a clarifying question of what is meant by full capacity for Examity for May 1st.
That's a great question. Kathy, do you want to try to tackle that one?
Sure, absolutely. So what they're going to do starting April 17th, they're going to open up the appointment capacity for those folks that those students that already had an appointment when this whole thing hit us. So they'll be given first priority, but then of course we know some of those students maybe found other ways or so wouldn't take those slots. So that's why they're saying the limited capacity will be what they have available. They certainly will let others fill those slots. May 1st, then they will be ramped back up to beyond the capacity that they had before all this hit because of all the extra folks that they are hiring right now.
Thank you, Kathy.
And Kathy, a quick question for you. When we were talking about Chromebooks compatibility with the various services that are now options for administering the TSIA, I got a response that just said that the person was on another WebEx with the College Board specifically, and the College Board said that for Chromebooks, they're temporarily turned off the kiosk mode, which means that students can use the browser instead. So it would allow them to use Chromebooks for virtual proctoring through Zoom. And I'm assuming they're alluding to there's no additional setup needed to make the Chromebook accessible to for the administering of the TSIA. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, that is correct, but I want to make sure everybody knows that you have to make sure in your branching profile that the test lockout session is turned on in test settings, because that will stop the student from being able to go anywhere else. So we want to just make sure everybody checks their test settings, and that is in the instructions that we have as part of the resource documents.
Thank you for that clarification. So this question in terms of, I'm assuming, I'm going to put it in the context of maybe Examity, but I do know, or let me ask the question first, Kathy. For those students that we have already issued vouchers, will they receive priority in being able to take their tests?
So the folks that will receive priority are those that already have an appointment, not necessarily just if you were quick and when you gave them the voucher and they made an appointment, they will have priority, but simply having a voucher won't give them priority.
And I'm scrolling through the questions, and a number of them we've already addressed. And if by chance I did not specifically address your question, all of our contact information is on the screen. So feel free to email me, Keelan Morgan, or Dr. Suzanne Morales-Vale. And then specifically, if you have a reporting question for in your institution of higher education, definitely you can email Dr. Melissa Humphreys.
I just want to reiterate also, if you're a school district and you have any questions, please go to your TEA designated person first, and they will be able to answer all of your TEA related questions. If it's anything that was covered specifically in the webinar today, we'll be also happy to address the question that was anything that was specifically covered in the webinar. But if it comes to funding and for the tests and for proctors and House Bill 3 and so forth, if you're in early college, high school and have any additional questions, please contact Stacy Avery at Texas Education Agency, and she will be able to address your questions if you're a school district or public charter.
And a question came in, is there any sense of whether Examity or ProctorU will actually have the bandwidth to handle or deluge the students who will need to test online? Will our students actually be able to get time slots? So I'll simplify it. Will those services have the capacity to meet the needs of testing?
So I can.
Or Kathy, and then I'll have Suzanne chime in on something specifically.
Okay, sure. So we are doing the best planning that we possibly can by looking at volume that we had from last year at this same time to give Examity, projected possible numbers that they might expect. But again, there's so many unknowns that are happening, as Stan said, changing daily. I can't tell you 100%, but I want you to know that we're doing everything that we can to help them plan.
And I just wanted to add it's an excellent question with regard to capacity. Unfortunately, like many other things, there are so many unknown factors. But that said, something that can certainly address the capacity issue is rather than having your students test in all 3 areas, test in only 1 or 2 areas, just to get them possible access to college credit courses immediately for the summer or even at minimal for the fall. And then, of course, also, as I mentioned, consider the non-TSI libel courses. Many of those are part of the institution's core curriculum and are certainly available for dual credit purposes. So that would be another option to consider to possibly address the known factor with regard to capacity with the remote proctoring services. Now, not using Examity or not talking specifically about Examity or ProctorU, remember, we also have the other web chat services, proctoring opportunities available, and you probably have a better idea on the capacity with regard to those because you know how many folks would be able to be TSIA certified, and you know what your local schedules might look like. One other thing that I wanted to reiterate, it's very important, especially for the dual credit population. The institution of higher ed and your partnering school districts, please, we highly recommend to have these conversations together. If the school district is having trouble, maybe they don't have enough access to certified TSIA proctors, the institution of higher ed might be able to help. And same thing, institutions of higher ed, reach out to your school district and public charter partners so that you can work together perhaps as much as possible, maybe even dedicating 1 day or 2 days out of the week for the institution's certified proctors to be able to proctor for dual credit students or other suggestions like that. But we highly recommend reaching out and working together to, it would be to benefit of both the school district and the institution, and of course, the student.
All right, that actually brings us to the end of the webinar. Say any closing thoughts, comments from our panelists?
I just want to say I am in awe of how much dedicated time school districts, charter schools, institutions of higher ed, how much above and beyond you're going right now, and how much I know that you're having to juggle all of the challenges that you're dealing with, but also always keeping the student's best interest in mind. So thank you, everyone. I know we're all giving 110%. So again, thank you. And I know your students thank you as well.
And just a reminder, if you have a colleague who is unable to secure a seat in the webinar, or you would like to review this information at a later date, it will be posted on the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board's YouTube page under the title of the webinar, so it'll be easily searchable. And Specifically, again, if you have any follow-up questions or concerns, feel free to email us directly. And I'm just echoing what Dr. Morales-Vell just said. We do appreciate all of your hard work, and we hope you and your family stay safe. You all have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.